Hello! Welcome back to All Along the Watchtower, hopefully the best Watchmen retrospective podcast on the internet. I am your host, Baylor Thornton, and I know it's been a few weeks. This is the longest hiatus we've had so far, but I have an excuse. This is the material for today's episode. 37 fucking issues. So between this and schoolwork, it was pretty suffocating to get through, so I'm sure you can forgive me here. Now, a little bit of background. The year's 2012, and hot off the success of DC's massive gimmick, the New 52, they decided to jump the shark again by making prequels to their most acclaimed graphic novel ever. This shocked and kind of appalled everybody. But at the time, I was a dumb kid. Watchmen was my favorite thing in the world. I watched a TNT recording of the movie like every week. So of course I was excited to get my hands on this, and yep, look, I collected all of the issues. I came back week after week to see what I would get next. While my thoughts on the movie have rapidly changed, my thoughts on these comics have not. As a kid, I feel I'm going to share exactly my opinions then and now. They have not changed really at all. So, a few general notes. 1, remember, there is precedent for this. There was that question issue that we talked about that featured Rorschach, so technically, yes, these characters can be used again. DC has every right to do so. Remember, Moore has used other people's characters many times before. Even Watchmen was modeled off Charlton characters, so objectively, no, there's no reason why this shouldn't happen. And I'll also say now that this is not original Watchmen. These are brand new books that can and should be their own thing and carve out a new path for themselves. And some of them do that, others don't. I also noticed that the artwork structure, like most of them, or at least like about half of them, are riffs on the original format, like not identical, but certainly like modeled off it, while some of the others just avoid it entirely, which would be okay if they did something interesting with it, but some of them just don't. I'll just say now that this, especially compared to original Watchmen, most of these are very unambitious books. The scripts are very short. There's just not that much to them. Like, there's a reason why I'm getting through all 10 of these books in one episode. There's just not that much to say about them, for the most part. The stories themselves are very brief, very low-key, which works in some of them's favors, but not all of them. And there's just a lot of prequel-y moments. By that, I mean like scenes like in the Solo movie, where you find out why he's called Han Solo. Just dumb moments like that, where you realize, oh, that's where that thing I recognize came from. Pretty much all of them are pretty lame. I'm not a fan of those type of callbacks. Like, there's clever ways to do callbacks, but most of them here are just not. So the rundown, here are the books. Minutemen, 6 issues. Silk Spectre, 4 issues. Comedian, 6 issues. Rorschach, 4 issues. Night Owl, 4 issues. Dr. Manhattan, 4 issues. Ozymandias, 6 issues. Dollar Bill, 1 issue. Moloch, 2 issues. And there's about a 30-part, 2-page backup story about the Crimson Corsair and most of these issues. So that's a lot of material to get through today. If you're interested, you can either buy all of these in 4 volumes, pick and choose which ones you want, Or if you want to get all of it, you can just get an omnibus with all of it. I'll be recommending which ones I recommend to you as we go. So the first book we're talking about is actually pretty great. Minutemen. Obviously, when you say the name Watchmen prequel, the first thing you're going to want to know is a Minutemen story that has the richest material to draw from. And yeah, they did a good job, because this is entirely the work of late great Darwin Cooke from DC The New Frontier. And this is very much in that same ilk, because it's very old school artwork, very eye-catching, cartoony old school artwork going on here, undercut with very serious and mature subject matter, like he did with that book. The artwork is awesome throughout here, because it looks very different from original Watchmen, but considering the time and place this one takes place in, it does fit in perfectly. It's different, but it's a new book, it's allowed to be different, and it does carve out a new path for itself. So the book revolves around Hollis Mason riding under the hood, and looking back at his time at the Minutemen. And, it begins, really earnest about it, but as you know more, you're, similar to the Under the Hood that you read in original. Yeah, once you really, dive in, you realize that it just wasn't what you think it is. It was really just all, razzle-dazzle with no real, actual crime fighting to it. And that works, because, the main, thesis of the book is how, fame and the publicity of it all is really more of a focus than actual hero work. Any actual hero work they do is either obscured or just flat out bullshit. My favorite character in this book is Silhouette, because you really get to know all of the old Minutemen in this book, but Silhouette really has the most time to shine here. She's really the moral crux of this whole thing. Because similar to what they do with Hooded Justice in the TV show, she's figuring out this whole vast and insidious conspiracy regarding child porn. Yet, because that's such an unpleasant topic, the Minutemen don't want to touch it. They just want to do bullshit to make them look good for the cameras. That might have been where Lindelof and company got their inspiration. I don't know. Wouldn't surprise me. And yes, and just like any good Watchmen book, this does have guts. Sure, it may seem kind of earnest and cheesy at first, but it does get subverted quickly with some pretty dark materials. Yet it's still similar to original Watchmen. It still has a soul. It's not just dark and edgy for the sake of it, we'll get to in a bit with some of these. There's some cool visual tricks going on, too. I really love how every issue begins with, semicircles. That's a common motif. And I really like how in Chapter 3, you get all these, really cheesy illustrations of the fictional comic books that the Minutemen appear in, while it's being juxtaposed with the real horrible shit they're doing. And I gotta give credit to Cooke for even jumping on this project, because he has criticized Watchmen before in the past for what it did to the industry. And I do think it's really cool how he was able to swallow his pride and deliver something unique and interesting to the table, because my two favorite books easily were both of his. There's a lot of cool stories going on here. I really love the part where the Minutemen infiltrate some communist lair, but it's really just a bunch of fireworks. And I also like the one where Hollis Mason actually does save the day, but it's obscured by the press because a Japanese boy was involved. I'll say the ending is a bit rushed, because they do this whole conspiracy with Hooded Justice, and by the end you never really know what happened. It just leaves you with this mistake that Hollis made, and he never really seems to know what to do with it. This kind of ends there, anticlimactically a little bit, but overall it's a pretty good story. I give it an 8 out of 10. Check it out. Next up is Silk Spectre, and I'll be honest, this one is my favorite out of all of them. It's another Darwin Cooke story with artwork by Amanda Connor. And I just really love this one. It was my favorite as a kid, and it's my favorite now. Because this one, above all of them, it does feel the most unique, because this does feel like a kind of like an R-rated Archie comic before Archie started actually doing that. It's like a really sweet coming-of-age story of Silk Spectre. Well, first, there's the dynamic between Lori and her mom is really genuine and has a lot of layers to it. And just, it's this great story how Lori, like, runs away from home and, like, just does drugs and fights crime in San Francisco for a few weeks. And there's just so much, it's a simple story, but there's just so much to it. For one, as you can see, this is the closest out of all these books to the original format, but it still does interesting things with it, because, like, there's all, like, these cute, like Christmas story-ish, like fantasies that Lori has that they do with doodles. That's really cool. And, like, there's this psychedelic sequence that breaks the format, and, like, every time, like, they break the format, there's intent behind it, and it does feel like it has purpose. And, like, the callbacks are really good with this one. Like, the whole, like, gem thing that Manhattan was talking about is referenced here, for instance. And, like, you see Red Death earlier. Like, it's more, like, clever references you have to actually, like, think about. The fact that it takes place in the late 60s and having Lori be, like, this hippie does go into her character, because as you see, she's a Devo fan. This kind of goes into all of that. And also just her rebellious nature against her mom. This does feel very much like what a younger Lori would have done. Sure, tonally, it's very different from the original, but like I said, I like that. It's a new book. It should be willing to do that. And there's also some good satire going on here, because, like, it's all about, like, the villains are, like, this, like, record industry that, like, manufacture, like, the Katie drug you see in original to, like, brainwash these teens to just, like, buy all this shit for them. Which, one, shows that the record industry people are terrible, and two, that boomers were always terrible because they claimed to be hippies, but all they did was consume shit, you know? And it's also a little bit of a superhero comic, because you do see Lori do some crime fighting and, like, sort of, like, dip her toes into the whole thing. I'll just say right now, there's a lot of Blake in these comics. Like, I get it's a prequel, and he's a character that only exists in the past, so you're going to want to take advantage of that, but holy crap, there's too much of him. But his appearance here in Silk Spectre number 3 is pretty easily my favorite out of all of them. It's easily, like, the most, like, multi-layered and interesting portrayal of him. Both that and the war story in Minutemen number 4. Like, Darwin Cook knew what to do with these characters. He knew what interesting places they could go. So yeah, I just really love this book. I really enjoyed going through it again. Just the writing is really simple and just poignant. The artwork is phenomenal. Cook and Connor, just this great duo that really do wonders together. Just fuck it, 9 out of 10. My favorite of the Before Watchmen books. And Volume 1 of Before Watchmen contains Minutemen and Silk Spectre, so by all means, pick that up. That's the only one of the 4 gets an enthusiastic recommendation from me. If you're a fan of this stuff, read these 2 books, please. Following my favorite, we have my least favorite, Comedian by Brian Azarello. This shit sucked. As a kid, I was always kind of disappointed by it. I don't even really think I finished it. I just bought the issues for the sake of completion. But reading it all again, oh boy, this is objectively shit. This is by far the worst of the 10 stories we're talking about today. First of all, I just want to say I'm not vibing with this Azarello guy. Like, I know he's done some acclaimed things like 100 Bullets and Hellblazer, but from everything I'm exposed to him, from these Before Watchmen books and the Killing Joke movie that he wrote, I am not vibing with this guy, not one bit. And second of all, why give this one 6 fucking issues? I mean, Minutemen, you have to give 6 issues. That is the biggest, most potentially, interesting and in execution interesting story of the bunch. Like, that earned, half the length of original Watchmen. Why did this, though? Is Comedian really that popular of a character to warrant 6 issues? And if he is, why not give Rorschach and Manhattan 6 issues? They're the 2 most popular of all of them. And I just don't get it. And it's not like Azarello asked for 6 issues, because Lord knows he had nothing for most of this, because this one has the most ads out of all of the comics. There's so much ad space. And 2, the scripts are obscenely short. Like, it often seems like nothing's happening in these. And just, there's no real narrative. It's just, he's just kind of Forrest Gumping it, just going through random moments in the later part of his life. There's some weird shit too, like, it begins and ends with the Wanderer as he's just kind of moping around. Like, why that song? That's way too up-tempo of a song to choose from. And 2, the way they portray the Kennedy family here is terrible. Especially Jackie. She straight up tells Eddie to assassinate Marilyn Monroe. Like, why would you do that? I don't understand the intention. Like, why would you make that family seem as, worse than Eddie? I don't get it. And they also, go walk back on the whole, Eddie killing JFK thing. He kills Bobby Kennedy at the end of this, but he doesn't kill JFK. Okay, that's just kind of confusing. And 2, just the timeline is really confusing throughout this book. They don't give years or anything like that, because, a lot of it takes place in Vietnam, yet it's before Nixon asks Manhattan to intervene, so it's kind of well, when is this happening? And there's this whole scene in the third one where he's just harassing these black protesters, which, to be clear, there's way too much shit about looters in these comics. There's so much shit that's obsessed with that. It doesn't seem like they understood that more was in the defense of the protesters during that riot scene in the original. You know, it just seems like they completely missed on the satire of that and just portraying these guys as the good guys, which they're absolutely not. And just Eddie's jokes here are shit. There's a part where he literally flings shit at a guy and acts like he's a monkey. 1, where he'd even get that, and 2, why would you show me this? It's not funny. It's not interesting. It's just really cringy and lame. Not to mention boring. This is a boring-ass comic. This was a slog to get through. It just does not seem like they're doing anything to critique this horrible man. They're just kind of showing him commit these atrocities, and he just completely gets away with it. In issue 5, he straight up commits war crimes and totally gets away with it. Just, oh my god, why are you showing me this if you're not criticizing it? Where's the point of view? Where's the satire? Where's anything? So yeah, 2 out of 10. The worst one of the bunch. Do not recommend it. Waste of 6 issues and $24. Just avoid. It sucks. The next one's also an Azarello comic. Thankfully, this one's a little better. It's Rorschach. Not Tom King's Rorschach, mind you. That hasn't come out yet. I'll talk about it when it has been released. One nice thing I'll say is that the artwork's done by Lee Bermejo, he did the artwork for Joker, probably Azarello's most popular book. And I'll just say here, the artwork is really cool. For one, just the organization is better here than it was in Comedian, because Comedian was just an ugly organized book, really disorienting in a bad way. Here, everything's really clean, despite how, even though the artwork's really fucking dirty, intentionally dirty. And 2, they just do a great job making New York City look like the grossest, just grimiest fucking place in the world. Like, this is hands down, like, aesthetically the darkest of the bunch, and for good reason. It's Rorschach. You kind of have to. Like, look at that. It is pretty cool. It's just to sit here and look at this. Like, that's the highlight of this whole thing. And there's some good visual jokes here. Like, I love this cover of the shoe. It looks like it's like Rorschach, but it turns out it's just a guy kicking down the door. Like, that's clever. The illustrator here certainly did a great job. Who didn't do a good job, however, is Azarello. Like, he does a better job here than with Comedian, but it's still not great. For one, I don't think he really gets the Rorschach character. Like, the most Rorschach-y scene in this whole book is when, like, he's put into this hospital and he leaves because he doesn't want to seem like a freeloader. That's the only really part that really goes into his demented worldview. Otherwise, it just seems like he's more familiar with the movie version than anything in the actual book, you know? Because there's no sense of humor or his monotone worldview or anything like that. He's just kind of pissed off the whole time. He even swears in this book, which is extremely out of character. He never swears in the comic. And he asks a woman out on a date. Like, why would he do that? He's terrified of sex. You know, it doesn't make sense. And just the action in general is too big. Like, there's a point where, like in the last issue where Rorschach's just feeding guys to a tiger. Like, that's way too big. Like, any action in the original is very small. It's just him picking up ordinary objects and turning it against people, you know? And just the story itself is very brief. Like, they probably could have done the whole thing in one issue if they really wanted to. It's just a very brief, like, nothing story. It's just focused on the atmosphere, which is entertaining, sure, to a point, but it doesn't really sustain 4 issues. The portrayal of women is pretty bad, especially at the ending. It ends with this really fucking disgusting monologue on Rorschach's part that just really dehumanizes women and has no real intent behind it, or point of view, or anything. I just don't get it. And there's this one particularly really, like, embarrassing moment in this book that feels extremely fanficky, because there's a part where Rorschach enters a taxi, and look who's driving. Travis fucking Bickle. Why would you do that? Why would you have this take place literally in the same, like, imply this is literally the same universe as Taxi Driver? Fucking Joker was more subtle with its Taxi Driver references than this shit. Ugh. So yeah, 4 out of 10. A lot better than Comedian, but I still don't recommend it. Especially in that volume 2, it comes with Comedian and Rorschach. By all means, skip that one. Do not. After that, we have Night Owl, which I wanted to be better than Rorschach, but it kind of annoys me just as much. There's better things going on here. There's moments in this that actually work, but there's also just really shitty moments too that kind of sour the whole thing. Like, I really like, the first issue is probably the best one because it does go into how shitty Dan's relationship with his dad was, and how Dan just straight up let him die. That was interesting. And how Hollis Mason was his real father. Like, all of the origin story going on here was kind of sweet. And it's thankfully a more sex-positive book than really most of these, especially compared to End Is Nigh Part 2, because this book also involves the Twilight Lady. And yeah, it's thankfully a better portrayal of sex than most of this Watchmen shit that I've been consuming. Which, the Twilight Lady stuff should have been the focus of this whole book, I feel, because this is Night Owl we're talking about. This should be the horniest fucking comic I've ever read, but it's really not. I mean, it's in there, but there's not that much to it. Instead, this is kind of more of an excuse to do Night Owl and Rorschach. It does lead into that whole dynamic, which, between of the two Rorschach-centered books, I do feel like this one gets the Rorschach character a bit more, because there is more of that cynical sense of humor he has, and that similar like faith in conservative institutions, because you see him as like this like really kind of like a geeky church boy. Like he spends his free time hanging out at this church. Like that was interesting. That's something I do imagine that's something a younger Rorschach would do. The artwork is kind of a mixed bag. For one, I should mention this is one of Joe Kubert's last projects. May he rest in peace. And the artwork is impressive at times. Like this is a really cool panel. But then there's other times where the faces just straight up suck. Where there's just really awkward facial expressions that really detract from what's happening. Like, why would you show me this face? What's the intent behind this really goofy-ass face? Like, that just really takes away from the scene. This one, too. Why would you show me that fucking Jerry Springer-ass smirk? Like, this should be a scary scene, but the really awkward facial expressions kind of sour the book in a lot of ways. I also think the book wastes too much time on certain things. Like, we see the fucking Crime Busters scene again, and there's several other points where you see it again and you don't need to. Like, Night Owl and Ozymandias are the two most egregious examples of that. There's no reason why we had to see it again, and without the politics, like, why are you showing me this? Doesn't seem like you even get it. And there's this weird thing with Hollis towards the end where he's like really embarrassed over writing under the hood, and it's like giving Dan the option whether or not to burn it. And it's like, it doesn't seem consistent with what happened in the Minutemen story. Like, that's a thing with these books. Like, there's a few points where they overlap, but not many. You know, like, this should have felt like one giant narrative, and it never does. I remember at one point they were going to do an epilogue, but they canceled it. I imagine that's why, because how can you connect any of these stories together? They seem so disconnected from each other in the canon. Like, any times they do overlap is interesting, but there's not enough. And my least favorite thing about this whole book is the climax, because you find out, like, the evil, like, televangelist church guy that Rorschach was working for is the villain, and he just has this really goofy monologue about how he was killing prostitutes, and I just can't take it seriously. Like, okay, you're going after the televangelists, whoop-de-damn-do, what are your jokes on airline food, you know, like, this isn't nearly as clever as you think it is, you know, it's just really goofy, and it goes against the tone of the book. I mean, there's stuff I like here. I like the stuff with Dan and Hollis, and the stuff with Dan and Twilight Lady when there's not the terrible expressions, but overall, this book's kind of a hot mess. I don't think they knew what they were doing, really. Like, it's not terrible, but it's also not that good. Feeling a 4.5 out of 10, maybe? I don't know, it's just, I can't really recommend it. To be a bit more positive, though, next we have my third favorite of the bunch, and the last one I'm able to fully recommend. Dr. Manhattan. This one is pretty cool. It's basically like Chapter 4 on steroids, because you pick up with Doc on Mars, and he's going through his life, but instead he's kind of doing the thing that Terry Gilliam would have done if he made the movie, where like he goes back in time and stops Dr. Manhattan from being created, and he's like just kind of going through all of the different possible universes of what would have happened if he didn't do it. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff. Like this one, like Silk Spectre, take the most advantage of being a comic book, because there's a lot of interesting stuff they do with the different universes. Like one page will be one scenario, like this one is a scenario with Blake, and here's the one of Ozzy. Like, there's a lot of stuff they do with the parallel universes and that whole interesting premise. And you see the Doc's pain, how he just he goes through all these different universes, and how if he doesn't do if he's not there every world will just collapse in on itself. Everyone will just lead to nuclear Armageddon if he doesn't do something about it. That was a cool place to take this, because it's technically goes into the prequel concept, but because of Dr. Manhattan's perspective, you can do more interesting things with it. Like, it even kind of ends with a sequel, because like the last few pages are him creating life like he said he would, and no matter what sequel you consider canon, that's going to be true. Just his characterization is also really solid in this. Like, there's the distant frustratedness that goes on with this character. You get also the attempts to love humanity. Like, it's a good, well-rounded story for him. There's also a point where you have to flip the book to understand it from Veidt's point of view. That was a really cool trick that I don't think I've seen in any other comic. I also think it's interesting how all of the JMS stories, this one, Night Owl, and Moloch, which we'll get to in a second, all feature daddy issues, all feature parent issues. I don't know what's going on there, but there's definitely an auteurist choice going on there, and I really like the character arc that Doc goes through here. Like, just like any good story about a god, he realizes that despite being the most powerful being in the universe, he has to give up his own free will so that other people can have theirs. Like, this is a good book. I'm able to recommend this one. 7 out of 10. It's pretty neat. I also forgot to mention this, but Alan Moore is credited for every issue of this, which is weird because he obviously does not want to be. I wonder why that's the case. I think they have to credit him because they use his dialogue so often. Like, this is not just using the characters. This is straight up using the book, the original book, to create these new ones. So I kind of think they had to, but I don't know. There's an interesting debate to be had with that. So next we have Ozymandias. And I'll just say right now that the artwork is awesome. Jay Lee did the art here, and it is genuinely outstanding. Like, every issue, every panel in these issues looks like a little portrait. Just the presentation of it all is immaculate. It's always interesting to look at. And it's thematically resonant too, because all of these poses and designs go into Veidt's hubris and how above it all he all feels at any given point. Like, I'm almost able to recommend this book on the artwork alone, because it is very unique from what I'm used to in comic books. This is visually a very cool experience. I just wish the story was at least half as good, because similar to Comedian, there is no reason why this had to be 6 issues with these cheesy fucking scripts that just mostly go into what we already knew about this character, what was better established in one issue of original Watchmen than the entirety of this whole book that he has. And this, including the crime buster scene, like I said, just feels like they're beating a dead horse. Like I said, this is a kind of a cheesy book, because there's attempts at humor, but they're all really stupid. Especially involving Bubastis when she pees on the floor or something. He's like, we have to get kitty litter. Come on, this isn't Nickelodeon. So yeah, boring story. Not much really happens that we don't already know. As a 6 issues thing, as a 6-issue book, it's kind of a slog. And just the portrayal of Veidt here is pretty boring. Okay, he sees himself as a god, so what does that entail? How did he get to such a point, This would have been more interesting if it was about him, losing his moral compass, but no, it just seems like he never really had one. He always just thought himself as a god, which is not an interesting story, because we know it's not true. There's no disconnect with it, If he's going to be this unreliable narrator, you have to give me reason to believe he's wrong, Anytime I do think he's wrong, I just think it's kind of bad storytelling. So between this and the movie, why do they always get Veidt wrong? He should be the best character, but no, they really dropped the ball twice. And also, it's also just such a sanitized version of him, because we talked a lot in those early Watchmen episodes how there's just a lot of like fascism and capitalism going on with this character that really contradicts with his peace-loving pacifist nature. This goes into none of that. It's a waste. I'll just say that. It's a waste. I'm feeling like a 4 out of 10 on this one. Artwork is great. Artwork's about a 10, but holy crap, it's still not enough to recommend this book. So, that's it for the 7 main ones, but there's still a few more I had to briefly go into. Like this one, the Dollar Bill one-shot. Yeah, this is probably the most obscure one out of all of them, because they only did fucking one of them, and nobody asked for this. Who asked for this? Was Dollar Bill really that great of a character to give his own comic book? Even if it's for just one issue, there has to be some reason behind this choice, but no, it does not make a case for it. Like, he's just one of the joke costumes of the Minutemen, and he had more depth in the Minutemen series than he does in this, because this is mostly just a rehash of what we saw in Minutemen. Sure, the artwork is pretty good. It's a different style from Minutemen, I'll say that, but that's not enough to justify this book's existence. And even as a kid, when I bought this one, I felt ripped off. Like, it's not the worst one, but it's easily the biggest waste of time. I'll be honest and say there's a little bit of satire going on here. There's a lot of, like, stuff about homophobia and, like, marketing, but it's all stuff that's just done better in Cook's book. Read that one instead, please. It ain't worth it. 3 out of 10, just complete waste of time. Then we have Moloch, the 2-parter. I'm not a fan of it artistically, I'll say. Like, it doesn't look that bad, but it is considerably the ugliest one of the bunch, which would be fine if there was purpose behind it, but I don't really think there is. But outside of the artwork, I actually don't mind this one. I'm not going to recommend it outright, but it's passable. It is one of the more interesting books of this series, because it's a nice change of pace, because, like, he's a more likable character. Even when he does bad things, like, you at least get it, you know? Like when he makes bad choices, it's at least interesting as compared to the comedian book, where there's just no motivation behind anything. And it takes advantage of only being 2 issues. Like, more of these stories should have just been 2, because this one goes into his life pre-incarceration, about how he was bullied as a kid and how he became this ruthless killer of a villain. And the second one picks up how he got out and how he was being groomed into being part of Veidt's conspiracy. Like, that's all you need. That was a good way to divide up the 2 sides of the story. And there's some interesting stuff going on with, like, the confession symbolism going out here, and how, like, he views Veidt as, like, a savior. Like, that's interesting. This is not completely worthless. It's a little cheesy at points, but I don't mind it. I'm feeling a 5, maybe a 6 if I'm generous on this one. Like, it's not bad. I'm not going to recommend it outright, but it's better than a lot of these. So that's it for the books that were actually sold. But there's a bonus. Well, almost every issue has 2 pages of the Crimson Corsair story. Because it's Watchmen, they had to do one. They had to bring in a pirate story of some kind, which, like I said with the Black Freighter short, that really goes against what the original comic was doing with the pirate stuff, because like I said with that short, the story in the movie version, like, the story itself is not that interesting. There's not that much to the Black Freighter story. The real meat of it is how it all connects with the main narrative and what's going on at the newsstand. That's why it's worth reading. But here is just kind of this irrelevant pirate story that has nothing to really do what's going on with any of these books. It's just here because, hey, pirates are a thing in the Watchmen universe, you know? I should say, though, that John Higgins wrote and did the art for most of this. And that's interesting because he was the colorist of original Watchmen, making him the only person to work on both original Watchmen and this. You know, that's just kind of random. And I'll say here that the art is good. Like, it is really grisly and eye-catching in a lot of ways. Like it is genuinely hard to read in a good way. I'll say that. Like, the artwork... for the disturbing mode the artwork is trying to portray, it does succeed. So I'll give it this. It's not boring, but it is kind of pointless. Because, for one, like I said, it has nothing to do with the main narratives. And two, there's just not much to the stories. There's kind of these, like... Well, for one, the protagonist doesn't really do anything. He just fumbles around like an idiot, getting into whatever situation happens until somebody rescues him, or by fate of chance he gets out of it, or whatever else. It's just really dumb. He's not a likable protagonist. Even the pirate guy in the original Watchmen was a better protagonist because he at least made choices. And just being a 2-page serial... Like, there's a lot of stuff that happens, but it doesn't feel like these ideas cohere. The beginning is okay, but it just really fizzles out by the end. Like, by the last 10 or so, it doesn't really make a lick of sense. And wow, what a bullshit ending. It just kind of ends on just a random moment. It feels like there could be 10 more to finish the story, but they didn't. It's just a very unsatisfying, rushed ending. It just makes me wish I didn't spend the time with this. 4 out of 10 again. I mean, it was an interesting sort of idea, and I didn't mind it at first, but wow, did it feel like a waste of time overall. So, Before Watchmen, what do I give this whole... If I were to give this whole endeavor a score, what would it be? 5 out of 10. That's the average. 5 out of 10. As an event, it's just right down the middle. There's 3 books that I'm willing to recommend: Minutemen, Silk Spectre, and Dr. Manhattan. But if we are to take this as one entity, I'm going to say no. It was not worth the endeavor. I'm glad the good ones happened, and due to the format of this whole thing, you are able to pick and choose which ones you like. It is easy to ignore the bad ones, but there's just so much more bad than good, and if I were to say if it was worth it, I'm going to say no. I don't know how I'll react to Doomsday Clock. We're getting to that next time, but there's sure to be something more interesting going on with that. I don't know if it's any good, but there's sure to be at least more interesting discussions, more going on with the story and the themes than almost anything going on here, because even the good ones are very simple. So, I'll leave it at that. Before Watchmen, I always thought was a very mid project, and I still have that opinion. I was really fucking excited for this too, and I was satisfied by the good ones, but not the bad ones. And I feel really the same way, so yeah, that does it for this time. I'll be back next time with Doomsday Clock. Bye.